And hello, everyone, and welcome back to our event, Changing the Media Narrative on Environmental Justice and the Climate Crisis. I'm Vanessa Maria Graber, and I will be moderating this part of our event. It's a panel with journalists. And if you were around for the first panel, there's a very clear mandate from organizers and policymakers on all the different ways that we can better cover this issue as journalists. So we're going to talk to three journalists who have been doing a really good job in the state of New Jersey of covering these issues. And so I put a link in the chat to slido.com. I will put it in there one more time. And it has the participant code in there that you could put. And the question that I have again is all about how can journalists do a better job of covering these issues. We'd love your responses, and then we'll take a look at them when we start the Q&A. So right now I'd like to introduce our panel of journalists. The first panelist we have is Taylor Jung, who is a multimedia reporter on the social justice beat, who joined NJ Spotlight News in 2021. Her reporting has focused on multiracial identity issues facing the BIPOC community, gentrification of Manhattan's Chinatown, and World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. She's a proud member of the Asian American Journalists Association and received her master's at Columbia Journalism School. And next, I'd like to present Stephen Rodas, who is a bilingual English-Spanish reporter who covers all things about New Jersey's changing climate and the people who are impacted. A Colombian American journalist born and raised in Jersey City, New Jersey, he's reported on environmental justice, new climate legislation, and budding development in parts of New Jersey most vulnerable to future storms. He's attended Syracuse University's S.I. Newhouse School of Public Communications. And finally, I'd like to present Amanda Oglesby, who covers the environment and education for the Asbury Press, where she has worked for more than 15 years. She writes about the Pinelands, coastal flooding, natural disaster resilience, offshore wind, and the defunct nuclear power plant at Oyster Creek. She's a lifelong New Jersey resident and a graduate of Rutgers University. Thank you so much, the three of you, for joining us today. I am going to get started with our first question, which is tell us a little bit about your experience covering climate issues in New Jersey. What are some of the issues that you focus on, and why do these issues interest you as a journalist? And we'll start with Taylor.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So yeah, as you mentioned, social justice reporter for NJ Spotlight News. That actually means that I cover everything related to social justice. So that could include environmental justice, also, disability rights, LGBTQ rights, racial equity, which tends to be a bit more of my focus. But, I started this beat and this job not with a focus of environmental justice, but I quickly learned, one of my first few stories actually was I interviewed Marcus Sibley, who we heard from earlier. And I quickly learned how we can talk about environmental justice in a way that really reveals the systemic racism that's existed in this country since its inception. And labor too also gave me that different framework for thinking about how I approach racial equity in these stories. So answer is I do a little bit of everything, but thinking more and more lately how to focus on climate change, especially because it's an existential threat and it's what we're experiencing as a reality day to day.
Thanks, Taylor. How about you, Steve?
Hey, Vanessa, thanks. Of course, the street sweeper's passing as soon as I get on. Hi, Amanda. Hi, Taylor. It's great to join everyone today. Yeah, so my experience in covering environmental topics has spanned actually 1 year as of this month, August. I've been working in New Jersey for about 7.5 years before that, doing more general assignment reporting. And similar to Taylor, but in a different way, I sort of cast a wide net, both geographically and topic-wise. So everything under the environment umbrella I'm looking at, and it is across the state. It means a lot of traveling. I was in Cape May yesterday, up from Jersey City, where I'm based now. And I tried to cover as much of a gamut as I can. Also, similar to Taylor, environmental justice is something that I do look at. I don't focus solely on, but it is something that has naturally come up being in New Jersey, and given policy and given other topics that naturally branch out from it or into it. So I want to also include that as one of my goals, which is to put it more at the forefront and to consider other ways and new ways for it to be covered in what we haven't seen already in the state, or expand ways that we have found it to be effective.
Thank you. How about you, Amanda? Tell us a little bit about what you cover, and how did you get to spend so many years covering these issues?
Well, I have not covered the environment, and the whole time that I've been here, I've worked my way up and been on all different desks and topics. But the last few years I've been covering environment as well as some other topics. I wear a number of hats here. But wildfire is a big issue in our area, and we have a lot of low-income seniors that live along this line, this wildfire risk area. And I worked through Sandy. I was here back then when that happened, and I saw the people who couldn't afford to recover, and everyone, our coverage area is the Jersey Shore, so we're really specifically focused on environmental issues that happen here. And I think there's a misconception that people who live here are wealthy, and that's true for a lot of people. And but there's also a lot of people that work in the service industry here that are seniors on limited incomes, and and there's communities that don't have that kind of wealth that we associate with the Jersey Shore that live here and are really susceptible to flooding, to storms, and don't have the resources to rebuild when something happens, or they don't have the resources to get necessarily the help they need or the attention from the government and the money that they're entitled to. So we've seen a lot of people with just less resources than their wealthy neighbor really having to fight for access to programs to help them in different environmental crises, whether it's trying to get access to the Blue Acres program, or whether it's just trying to get, or suffering from clawbacks from money that they've received for rebuilding. So I really focused a lot on flooding and sort of those kind of climate disasters that are playing out in not so slow motion here for our communities.
Amanda, are you seeing more and more of that in recent years?
Compared to what Sandy did and Irene a decade ago, I mean, those were just gigantic slaps in the face for our communities. And I think in a lot of ways, what you're seeing today is everyone kind of forgetting what happened. It's a 10 years out. And also what happened is the poorest people just were forced out by the financial crises that followed this. And now, you have a lot of people that were displaced for years after that. And it's really reshaped the Jersey Shore in a lot of ways. And not all of them are good ways, because it's become so unaffordable to live here. And that is sort of part of the environmental story here.
That's an interesting frame, the juxtaposition of gentrification and displacement with environmental issues and natural disasters. I want to react to some of what was said in the previous panel, which is around the idea that, yes, there is disproportionate amounts of flooding and displacement and other air and land quality issues affecting not just poor working class people, but also communities of color, in particular Black and Latinx communities. But also acknowledging that and trying to frame these stories in a way that makes the public realize that this is an issue that affects all New Jerseyans. And so how do you frame your reporting and framing of this issue? How do you tell the story of environmental racism and the health disparities in communities of color? And also what needs to change in newsrooms to draw more attention to these disparities and center the voices of the people most impacted on the front lines?
I can take this one if that works, Vanessa.
Yes, please just jump in.
Yeah, I feel us journalists were kind of in the line of fire from that last panel, but I mean, that's okay. That it's good to have those open kinds of dialogues. And I feel like in my experience, I've tried to infuse a lot of, when it comes to source building, when it comes to data usage, when it comes to what the reporting actually includes, for that to naturally include diversity. In New Jersey, it's so super diverse. I grew up in, in the Heights in Jersey City, statewide, that, can apply to, people's backgrounds, where they've come from in terms of a different country, or where in terms of like their earnings, in terms of their age. So it is a very diverse state, but I think that there's no trade-off for just getting out there, just getting outside, like leaving the desk, try not to work, always siloed in. We use that term a lot in the last panel, siloed, and don't physically be siloed in either. Try to get out. And when it comes to the tools that we have to bolster the reporting, don't put that always at the forefront, or I try not to like really at all. When the state DEP released its lead-based paint database some months ago, I looked for the red areas and got in my car and drove out to some of those places and knocked on doors and talked to people about what they were facing, to capture the reality of that. And I'm very happy that my parents made sure I didn't lose my ability to read, write, and speak Spanish. So I try to use that in my reporting as much as I can. Sometimes, it means that people I talk to are not used to speaking to a reporter. So it's important to also have the education behind those conversations. Don't solely look for a quote or quotes, but look to talk with people, open a dialogue, and say, this is what I'm doing. Do you have any questions for me? How can I expand not only this conversation into other stories, but also this relationship, so that, I come to this neighborhood in the future, or you recommend someone else that I speak to. So I guess it might be like a long way of saying, try to do as much of that on the ground reporting as you can. Try to use the tools that you have to then be informed by the people, and then the conversations you have with advocates. I've talked with Marcus, and Julie on multiple occasions. Haven't talked with Nicole Miller yet, but I want to absolutely, and we will in the future. But using those relationships to then link to people, just ordinary, regular folks living their day-to-day lives week to week in New Jersey, and try to tell stories that some might say, is something you could have written about any day, but really, like, how long has the climate topic been a news story? It's been like that for quite a while. It's our job to capture it in interesting and engaging and important ways.
Thank you so much. I'd like to toss it back to Taylor and Amanda and learn more about how you approach the work, given all of the, the context that the policymakers just provided.
Yeah, I'll just I'll jump in too. I think one thing, especially when you're doing work that revolves around talking about racial equity, is to always try to understand that, like, you'll be in a constant state of learning about how to talk about these things, who you should be talking to, how you're referring to these issues, and removing any sort of ego of like, oh, I got this thing wrong, like that. Focusing on that, and instead of just focusing on the people who are telling you this is how we should be referred to, this is how we should be talking about these things. Because I think that sometimes I see it, or in just anecdotal conversations with other journalists, is like they say, like, well, I don't know how to report on this issue or the communities of color, so I'm just gonna not. And what we talked about earlier is that we really need everyone coming together. Especially our editors, those in decision-making positions, need to, try to move away from this idea of like, we need both sides in these stories, journalism needs to be quote unquote neutral. So I think a lot of the work that I do, or how I approach my stories, is I listen as much as I can. I'm already on the internet a lot, unfortunately. So, whenever I see someone tweeting about something or creating a TikTok, I try to listen and about that perspective, hear about how people are actually talking about these stories, what are their lived experiences, and then use that to inform the kinds of stories that I tell. I think this is just a total aside, not really related to climate, but sort of. But, with Beyonce's concert this past weekend, I saw all these videos in my social feeds about people walking on the highway just to get to the MetLife Stadium. And that would have been a perfect example of, people and other reporters doing a story about how, New Jersey transit infrastructure is kind of sucks, is not well connected, is very confusing, and then, use that to spotlight that issue. So again, that's not climate related. I wish I had a climate related story to share, but that's just an example of like where I'm trying to think of some like real world things that people are experiencing. But I also do a lot of work, I think, more internally in the newsroom to inform people about how they should be covering their stories. I'm a social justice reporter. I'm also one of the only women of color on the digital side reporters. So I try to at least say that, like, even though this is my beat, we all share this beat. The health reporter, the environmental reporter, you all are covering social justice. And I think a part of that too is like, fortunately, just use 2020 racial reckoning as that like point in time. I think newsrooms are still trying to understand what to do with these like racial equity, social justice, environmental justice beats they've created and how to divide that work amongst all the reporters. But, I think as much work as journalists can do in their newsroom to teach each other about like, how do we share the work when we talk about racial equity, especially environmental justice, I think it's really important.
Thanks. And as someone was saying in the chat, the Beyonce story is a climate story. How we get around is directly related to the environment and the global boiling. Amanda, do you want to chime in as well?
I just feel like as a white woman, I know I'm not doing the best job possible getting into these communities and telling their stories. I know that. I want to do a better job at it. And it's something I'm always looking to do better. And we have a lot of diverse communities in our area, but too often down here at the shore, you have wealthy white people taking control of the environmental news stories. They hire lawyers to fight a big project, or they get, they have an organization behind them that holds a big rally, at the boardwalk, and they're able to get this kind of media attention on their issue. And too often the media their heads turned towards that and not towards the quieter stories that don't have an organizer or a big organization or a lot of money behind it to get attention on that issue. And I know that is something that we need to do better. So that's
why we're here. And I just want to also shout out the diverse sources database that the Center for Cooperative Media provides. And also, I don't know if he's still here, but Oni Avankula, he is with the center and coordinates their ethnic media program. And so oftentimes, as people who are journalists, who are also organizers, what we try to do is foster collaboration, and sometimes working with ethnic media, people do have access into those communities, can be a really good way to meet sources and to find out the story, or to work with people who speak the language. And so I definitely encourage those two things as a resource. I want to move along to some of the stories that you have covered. And I thought of this question because when I was a radio reporter working for WDAD AM in Western Pennsylvania, I used to cover the local government. So I would go to city council meetings and board of supervisors, and I went to a teeny tiny town called Burrell Township, and it was a pretty standard meeting. And as you know, there's sometimes rules for who can public comment. And during this particular meeting, there was a large group of people there, and they were very much concerned about one of the coal plants that was located in the township. And unfortunately, they didn't follow proper procedure to get on the public comment, so they weren't able to bring their concerns to the Board of Supervisors. But because there were so many of them and they had pictures, I talked to them afterwards. And to be honest, nothing really was happening at that particular Board of Supervisors meeting. I think they were arguing over a stop sign. And I discovered that many of them were there because there is so much coal dust that was coming off the trucks that were coming and going from the plant. and that dust was accumulating in their gardens and backyards and on their windows, and it was even leading to respiratory problems. And I felt like that was a really big story to cover. Even though I was pretty young and like in the middle of nowhere, I ignored everything else happening in that meeting, and I ran with that story. Of course, the other stations on the newspaper, the Indiana Gazette, ran all the procedural stuff that happened in that meeting. But our story got so much traction and so many calls that the next day, the competing station and the newspaper also ran that story. And as a result of all of our stations and the newspaper running that story and amplifying them, despite them not being able to get onto the public comment, what happened is that the EPA eventually came to investigate and take samples of the air and the land. And it led to an investigation, which made the residents really happy because ultimately that's what they wanted. And so that's really one of the few times in my life, my career, where, you know, just a nobody reporter like me at the time was able to make a difference, you know, with a story that ran for 2 minutes on our local radio station. And so at a young age, that really inspired me into the power of journalism and how that can work to hold people in power accountable. Can any of you think of an example of a time when you covered a story that led to some accountability, policy change, or even some harm reduction for a community impacted by climate or environmental issues?
Yeah, I
Steve,
think,
yes, go ahead, Steve, jump in.
yeah, I mean, so there's like a few different things I'm happy to say, and kudos to you, Vanessa, by the way. There's no and no such thing as a nobody reporter. So that was a great thing. Yeah, I'm happy that following a report that we published on the issue of abandoned boats last March, there was legislation introduced by Senator Testa. Granted, it's still sort of languishing, but there was legislation that was introduced, and that included a $25 million allocation to address the issue of boats being neglected on waterways or abandoned in public areas. You know, happy to see that a story we did on Johnson Park Zoo, a Middlesex County zoo, resulted in the closure of that and 2 other county zoos in Middlesex County. The zoo was flooded after the remnants of Tropical Storm Ida in 2021. And also the NJ Food Council reached out after the bevy of plastic bag ban stories that we published to say that, you know, our coverage was instrumental in the success of the law. You know, I sort of acknowledge that all 3 of those stories don't necessarily impact communities of color, and it's been top of mind for me for sure this year, and you know, since the beginning of this year, to think about other ways that other stories can have impact and ways to sort of work on projects that, you know, do focus in those areas. But yeah, those are sort of 3 examples that I thought of. We've had coverage on the CPV Woodbridge Energy Center in Keysby, which a lot of advocates have reached out and saying has, you know, propelled some of their advocacy too. Nothing, you know, specifically when it comes to, you know, laws being changed or action from the state's part, but I did want to mention that one as well.
Those are all really great examples, and hopefully gives you the motivation to keep going, right? Like when you see some positive impacts, you know, following journalism. How about Amanda or Taylor? Have you experienced anything like that?
My story is a really small potatoes story, I guess. There was a town in the Bay Shore where they had a bunch of homes on the side of the street where the Bay Shore has had a ton of flooding. They have a relatively low income working class community. And the creek near these homes had turned over the years because of flooding and more rainfall, and it just eaten away the properties under these houses. Literally, the ground was gone. The creek was underneath the houses. They're on concrete blocks and stilts, and they've been abandoned because of safety issues. And these people did not have resources to just sell this home that is now worthless and go move somewhere else. They were in really bad situations, and the town, being these tiny cash-strapped boroughs, didn't have the money to deal with this. And they go to the state and the state has Blue Acres funding, which in theory should have been used in a situation like this. And the state was like, no, we don't, this isn't what we want to deal with and put our Blue Acres money towards, because, we want it for big park spaces and this doesn't really qualify. We don't really want it. So the town is stuck with these dilapidated, raccoon-filled homes over creeks that are really dangerous. And I wrote about it and I made the DEP look terrible, and I made a bunch of enemies with the DEP, and they yelled at me for a while by email. And then a year later, the DEP comes out and holds a press conference on this street celebrating the Blue Acres program coming in and buying this stretch of homes. And the mayor comes up to me after this press conference and pats me on the shoulder and says, if you hadn't written that story last year, this would not be happening today. So it's a little tiny story, but things like that can get the ball moving in communities that need a little extra help.
Thank you for that example. And again, no story is too small, and they all have positive impact. So I thank you for sharing. I am seeing in the chat that unfortunately, New Jersey Lieutenant Governor Sheila Oliver has passed. And so just offering a moment of silence to acknowledge that that's happening, and that's breaking news. As journalists, we're always, on top of everything that's happening in real time. So just wanted to acknowledge that it's a really big, unfortunate story. And before we continue on, so just take a moment to remember the Lieutenant Governor. Okay, thank you for the folks who reached out via text and in the chat to let us know when that happens. We are going to continue on with our next question. What's been the biggest challenge in covering these issues, and what resources do you need to do your job better? How can people working on environmental issues and those impacted by them collaborate with you to better cover them?
I'll just say, continue to just call us up, as people already do. Let us know what issues people are facing, or what successes that you all have, or even if there's an event that maybe, there was a comment made earlier about how journalists are very reactionary and only go when to a certain community or advocate when there's something bad happening. I myself am trying to change that this year. I think we could all say here it's really hard, especially when your editor's like, can you just do a quick story about this burning fire, and then you can get back to your happy story later on, and then that never happens. But I myself am trying to push away from that as much as I can, even if it's a tiny story. So please do let me know. Let any of us know when there is something that's going on, where if you had, like I said, a success with either pushing a bill forward, or if it's an event to raise awareness, that's always really helpful. I think that, journalists, PR people, advocates, also people, just general public people, we all have a very symbiotic relationship, and it's important to have open communication. And I think that's one of the positives about social media, although there are many negatives, is that there's that immediate access you could have to us. People will tag me every day, and I think we had a conversation too, I see in the chat, about how it's sometimes the loudest people, with the most funding or whatever, who are getting that coverage. But they feel free, they have the audacity sometimes to tag me in some really insane stuff. So you have more than the right to tag me as well if you see something that you think needs to have my attention.
How about for you, Steve?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with a lot of what Taylor said. In terms of what have been among the largest challenges, I think that the focusing on environmental stories, learning curve has been a learning cliff. It's been suddenly you're spending 2 days reading these super expansive documents about just how does this thing and this thing work together, or what's a protected species observer, or what is this this energy sector, what's been its history, and that sort of thing. So it could come down a lot to like educating yourself on things that can be super complicated that people went to college for years and years to learn, to then communicate to the general public, do. And I think that, goes back to like the sources that Vanessa, both you and Joe have talked about that are accessible, how connecting with the right experts and developing some of those relationships so that you can know like which like 2 or 3 people that know more about you about X, Y, or Z you can contact like on deadline, not contact to set up an interview for tomorrow morning. Like, I need to file this in 30 minutes, so I need to hop on the phone with you, sort of doing the work so you can establish those relationships. So then be able to do that, I think, is important. And then in terms of telling of the stories, I mean, the bandwidth part is tough. Monday to Friday, my inbox is oof, it's like it's going right now as we're talking. And obviously that comes down to myself and developing my ability to like juggle different things and working on different things. But there could be certain weeks where there could be a lot of climate news coming down the pipeline, and it might mean like working with other reporters that have other beats that branch out from yours that you can work to develop those stories, or pausing and working on something in the immediate, or sometimes just because there's too many things, if you want to give stories the right amount of breadth, you might not always be able to cover everything. So that's kind of just a reality. And I don't know if this is the smartest thing to say, but like, exclusives, like give me something that no one else has. Reach out to me as an advocate, and if it's a story that because of the topic or because of a news tied to it that's coming down the pike that is super time relevant, my channels are open not just to those conversations, of course, but to general conversations. 2 other things I would say are, tell me how this is in context to other states in the US. Not only tell me the news, this is happening in New Jersey, this is why it's important for New Jersey and the history, but tell me like why this is a big deal compared to, let's say, California, that's so much more ahead of New Jersey in terms of climate policy, or another place in the country. And then separate from that, I would say, tell me more about the solutions that are happening to address that issue. So like, of course, like solutions-based journalism has been growing, and there are lots of great resources provided for that. So I would say, yeah, when reaching out and getting in contact, it would also help to, I know some have been doing it, but to continue to, or to add that component to what we hear.
Thank you. Those are all really good tips. But I hear in both of you, like the relationship building is really key. Amanda, would you agree? Do you have anything else to offer?
Well, this isn't anyone's power here, but sadly, I think what we really need is just more journalists. When I started, back when dinosaurs were on the earth, there were 2 solely devoted environmental reporters at the Asbury Park Press, one for Ocean County, one for Monmouth County. And, you didn't have to juggle beats. I mean, now I cover environment, education, and I do breaking news on Sundays. So, all of us at a paper like mine, we're doing so many different things at the same time. And that means there's only going to be maybe 2 environmental stories that I produce that week, and everything else is going to be on different topics. And unfortunately, it makes for competition for my attention. And so I would say, have a really, if you're going to approach a journalist with a potential story, have a really compelling human element in that, somebody who's living it. And that will help get our attention and get that story covered. If we can tell it through somebody's lived experience, that's what we're looking for. That kind of story that brings an environmental story into your home and makes you relate to it. So if I could have every one of you email me something like that every single day so that I had my story queue lined up, that would that's exactly what I need. So when you think about getting your issue covered, think about who in your neighborhood, or who do you work with, or who are you interacting with that is the face of this issue that you can bring to a journalist and is willing to share that. So
thank you for that. Before we dive into the Q&A part, because I've already gotten a bunch of questions, I do want to jump to the Slido to share what folks have said. So hold on, let me pull that up one second. All right, here we go. Question number 2 was, how do you think journalists can better report on climate and environmental issues? What info do you need? I'm not going to read all of them because there's a lot of responses, but I will read a few saying they should be able to use some numeric information correctly, inspire people for standing up for healthy lives for themselves and future generations by stressing the grave results of the exemplary activities in their region and not by reflecting sentiments only. So I think that has to do with showing some models and best practices, right? And speak in a way the general public can understand without much, not using academic wording or so. I think that speaks to the challenge that Steve was talking about, and having to take really complex scientific information and break it down in a way that people can understand very easily. Journalists should focus more on the negative impacts of deforestation and their invaluable positive contributions to natural balance for living, and especially decarbonization, rather than the just descriptive news coverage stressing sentimental and even justicides of cutting down forests and destroying agricultural land for the purposes of different land uses like construction, polluting industries, mining, and quarrying. Don't blindly print the points from those with a vested interest in the status quo. Tell the story as well as what can be done, what can citizens do, what can go right in addition to sharing the story, the data. I think, yeah, Steve mentioned solutions journalism. Listen out for who's losing out as events pan out and which organizations are taking. And I'll just end with this one. Bring intersectionality to climate reporting and include more information on how US transition affects people in the global South. And this is such an important point. One of the things that the UN has tried to really amplify is how people in the global South are disproportionately impacted by the climate emergency, especially in regards to famine and flooding. And if you do search more international news sources, you'll see a lot more of that reporting. Unfortunately, we don't see a lot of that at the local level, but I think that we can do a better job of connecting those dots. So I'm going to move us to the next question. And again, all of this will be shared with you in a post-event follow-up. So folks asked for a transcript and for a recording. You'll have all of this. So if you did register and have your email, we will send you the link to all of these things. So the last question I would like folks to answer is, what changes in the law would you like to see the governor take? And how about the Biden administration? Again, not everyone is in New Jersey. We have folks all over the country. Of course, in response to the Secretary General talking about being in an era of global boiling, the Biden administration did launch some efforts to combat climate crisis, although many advocates say it's not nearly far enough. So what changes would you like to see? Let us know in the Slido, and then we will share with you at the end. So I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to go to the question and answer document. So let me see. Okay, this one is from Leslie, and she asks, what are the best ways for advocates to keep media engaged with a local issue that has been dragging on for years and years with little to no change? Just because it's bogged down doesn't mean that it isn't important. And how can we spin it to pique interest among already too busy journalists? Well, I think that's a hard question to answer. But what would you do if somebody approached you about a story that was like, I live in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and Martin Luther King Drive going into the Ben Franklin Bridge is always flooded. That whole area floods all the time. It's quite frequently in the news, although there's no action on it. I think a lot of people in Camden are concerned about flooding, and you could probably take any city in New Jersey and there's similar issues. What would you do to try to continue that coverage, even though it's a well-known established fact?
I think that even though it's an issue that's been dragging on for years, to me, that is the story, that it's been dragging on for years and nothing's been done. A lot of times too, these politicians make campaign promises, and sometimes you know, as journalists, we do it, we just check in and see like, hey, where are they at with that promise? I think that for me, you know, especially with social justice, there were so many promises made, especially in 2020. And at least the way that I see my job is continuing to hold politicians' feet to the fire. And this kind of answers an earlier question of like, what impact do you see? Like, they are listening, they are seeing the coverage, even if they don't react to it. So I still think it's important to make noise about it. But I think how you can help us too is just, you know, of course, obviously, if there's a new, like new part of the story that hasn't yet been shared because it's just developed, maybe like the other piece of infrastructure has died, or, you know, there's new complicating factor, like that's obviously always worth updating. But if you could tell us, always like share with us the why, like why is this story important? And as we mentioned earlier, like what's the human interest element there? Is there a person being directly impacted? Those, it's not just like helping us sell the story to the editor, but it also helps, you know, broaden the audience of like who might be interested in this story. Because often when someone, you know, a lot of us, we cover policy and it's very boring, honestly. So if we can show, like, demonstrate the impact directly on people or animals, that always makes the story more engaging as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Karen Levinson writes, animal agriculture uses the same playbook as the fossil fuel and tobacco industries: misinformation and active, well-funded lobbying of politicians. It is the second leading cause of climate change and the leading cause of methane and nitrous oxide emissions, deforestation, ocean dead zones, food insecurity, freshwater depletion, and pollution, and zoonotic and chronic diseases. Even if we got rid of fossil fuels, we would not be able to meet our net zero goals or keep the warming below 2 degrees Celsius. Yet the animal agriculture and food system contributions to climate change is not at all covered in the media. Can anyone speak to this? I guess the question is, you know, why isn't it being covered? Should we cover it more? Is this an important part of the narrative that needs to change?
Yeah, I mean, so it's I'm not an animal agriculture expert. I mean, it's probably plain, but it goes back to what I think what I said about becoming educated in topics, and sometimes something like this could come across my email. Someone's introducing something, and you're sort of, at a position to say, okay, this is not, or this is a story. And sometimes just because of what you do or don't know, you can't make that call at that point. Not to say that animal agriculture isn't a story. I think it's about finding ways to, make it relatable to what's happening in New Jersey, or what's happening to a certain person, what's happening in a certain place. Whether this is something that's sort of like super dire that needs attention like as soon as possible, or a long-term issue. I think that again depends on like looking into it more. So yeah, I mean, I appreciate the question. I can't quite say whether or not it is, but it does remind me of talking with folks at like the Surfrider Foundation about the topic of like sand replenishment last fall, and not knowing anything about it and writing about it for, was it our newspaper like last month in July. So it took from November to July to basically like empty my plate enough to look into the topic, and then ultimately write something that like we were happy with, and we published, and we were able to expand on the topic more. And it's hard to ask someone to be that patient sometimes, especially if like as an advocate or a resident, and they're like, no, this is happening right in front of me. Like, I don't have that much time. I don't have that much patience. So I think that's what makes it sort of difficult. But yeah, that would be sort of my short way of answering this, which feels like it merits more attention. But yeah, I think that's where I leave it.
Yeah, I think policy briefings are helpful too, right? Like if this is an underreported issue, working with groups like Free Press and the Center for Cooperative Media, to bring journalists into the fold to better educate them on these issues. And certainly, when we talk about the climate crisis, it's not just about weather, right? And it's not just about pollution, but obviously it involves these issues as well. So I think that is the whole purpose of this conversation, right? Is to take note in the various angles and frames that we can cover this issue. I think data and reporting is another way to get people to cover the issue. So if there's data on these things, right, like how much of a, you know, cattle industry, a farming industry, like how are those things unfolding in New Jersey and in surrounding areas?
Yeah,
I think,
and I would say, when I started to interrupt you, Vanessa, but I would say like a sort of our overarching thing too, I think, which is what others have alluded to, is like saving legwork. And obviously it's my job to do the legwork to get to the bottom of the story and to the reporting. But I've had like groups, and this isn't directed at anybody, but I have groups and organizations ask me if I want something on embargo. Yes, I want, don't ask me if I want it or not, just give it to me on embargo, tell me the specific time and day, but it sort of adds an extra step for no reason. Sometimes that can sort of get in the way when you're looking at like 20 emails in an hour. Just save the legwork and just communicate that something's on embargo. And then when it comes to residents, and Taylor touched on this, is it's like the visual stories and the you know, but whether it's a video or a picture, like you could ask me if I want a video or photo of it that you have, but if you have it and it's available, it's easy to send it when you initially reach out. Like it'll sort of help sort of like, you know, get us to then get to the call or to the in-person interview or to the visit quicker. And I think that ultimately helps everyone.
yeah, I just want to read something from the chat from L. Sontag that says, you have to give the reporter sources, and it has to be from reputable journals, not just your org's communication. So I think that's a point well taken. I'm not a print person, and I think test video and audio go a long way too. If people can tell their story or get testimonials from people impacted, like don't always send a press release, right? Like sometimes as journalists, we get a lot of press releases and it takes a long time to read. And so, you know, think of other ways to communicate, like using multimedia tools. And so sometimes when I work with organizations, I try to get them to make testimonials and put it on their YouTube so that it's like a different way, putting a face to some of these issues. You know, this is for all types of social justice issues, but don't rely simply on a press release because it might not even get seen, like in our crowded email boxes. Is 1:55? We have to wrap it up soon. There's so many good questions. I wish we had time to answer all of them, as what happens when we have a really good conversation. I do want to jump back to the Slido to share some of the responses in terms of policy changes. And let's see what we have here. Okay. So the question is, what changes in the law would you like to see the governor take? How about the Biden administration? And so here we have, the governor needs to hold to his campaign promise to stop raiding the Clean Energy Fund. The state needs to fully fund New Jersey Transit as a separate budget item. We need to tax fossil fuels, fund public transit. Give more teeth to the enforcement of environmental justice violations. Yeah, unfortunately, the Supreme Court has a lot to do with that and sort of taking away a lot of the authority some of our federal agencies have. New Jersey needs to consolidate programs so that money can more effectively reach those who need help the most. I think that's more of a general statement. We need to get the meat and dairy lobby out of USDA policymaking, which requires dairy in school lunches. On the federal level, we need to tax animal agriculture instead of supporting it with subsidies. Support rules and regulations that will help enhance healthy survival and not degeneration and death. Well, just use logic and the wisdom of being human. We'll end on that note. I want to thank all of our panelists from the first panel, Nicole Miller, Marcus Sibley, Anjali Ramos, and the panelists from our second panel, Amanda Oglesby, Taylor Jung, and Stephen Rodas. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for sharing your experience and some of the calls to action that you made on how we can talk about this issue, cover it better in the media, and better advocate for a cleaner, greener New Jersey. We are going to be following up, so you'll probably get a message from Joe at the Center for Cooperative Media that has the Zoom recording. It has a transcript, links to the Slido, and we'll also put out an invitation to folks who want to gather again and meet in a working group to talk more about these issues. Of course, we're always here to foster collaborations between journalists and the community at large. If you support our work, check out our various websites, njpeak.org, njlcv.org, freepress.net, and centerforcooperativemedia.org. Funders, if you're on the call, heed the call from journalists. We need more journalism. We need new support and funding for this important issue. There's definitely not enough of us covering this issue across the state and the country. And if you're a journalism educator on the call, please reach out. We'd love to talk more with you on how we can change journalism education to better inform and educate our students for a career in environmental journalism. Thank you so much, everyone, and we hope you'll join us again for another talk.
Lastly, before you go, if you do any reporting off this, send it to us so we can help share and promote and spread the word about all the great work you all are doing. Thank you. Thank you, Free Press. Thank you, everybody. Keep an eye out for an email from me, folks.